Good morning. Welcome to Conversations with Caryn. My guest this morning is Marc Moorash, and Marc comes from a long line of family bookmakers. And today we're going to be talking about Art Young. Art Young was a political cartoonist, one of the world's, actually the country's most prolific from about 1900 to 1940. He died in 1943, kind of vanished into oblivion. Nobody really heard of him or knows of him, unlike many others. And you've gone on a one-man battle to resurrect him. Who is he, and why are you doing that?
Good morning. Thanks for letting us talk for a little while. Art Young, known as the Dean of American Cartoonists, the best-known political cartoonist in the country, 1900 to 1940, was published everywhere. Things you wouldn't have necessarily heard of, Puck and Judge, Metropolitan. But then later on, he was in the New Yorker, and that New Yorker style cartoon where it's a one-line caption, that comes from Art Young working on a magazine called The Masses in the 19-teens. They really started that style. So every time you see one of those cartoons and you go, aha, I know that style, it traces all the way back to Art Young. And
what kind of things did he draw about?
He was on the front lines of all of the labor activism of the day. He worked with Margaret Sanger in the Birth Control Review, was on the front lines of the women's suffrage movement. He was very good friends with Helen Keller, who was a part of that as well. We actually have a drawing of Helen Keller sitting on the steps of his house that he did. Labor, social movements, political activism, anti-capitalist, anti-greed predominantly. He was one of the first to really speak up for how poorly the veterans were treated after World War I, when there were hundreds of thousands who were out of work and injured for more than a decade. So what's great about him is you see that he didn't have a political line. He had the benefit of all people involved. He worked with Eugene Debs, who was the candidate who got 1 million votes for president after being jailed by the U.S. government. And so what I like to say to make it relate to now, if Art were a Young, he'd be illustrating for Bernie Sanders without a doubt.
So what led you to, how did you find out about him, and what led you to this lengthy quest you're on?
Well, our town historian in Bethel made a kind of rude crack about him in a book that he wrote, and it made me think, I need to look into this guy. So I started looking up Art Young and couldn't find very much about him. But what I'd find were these illustrations with the fat cat capitalist, Mr. Monopoly, rich Uncle Pennybags. That drawing is a direct descendant of what Art created: the top hat, the mustache, the cane, the monocle. He was the first to really do that. And we came across this piece titled Capitalism, with the big fat cat capitalist drinking out of a trough, tipping backwards from his buffet table and about to fall into an abyss. And I looked at it and I thought, this speaks to me. Well, then I looked a little farther, and it turns out he lived in Bethel from 1904 to 1942, a mile from where the Historical Society is in Bethel, where I'm on the board of directors there. And turned out he had an art gallery that he built on his property. And so all of these things just led me to want to learn more. And then one thing after another, a number of amazingly serendipitous events. William Reese Company, Terry Halliday in New Haven, a bookseller, had a bunch of letters from Art to his wife, and they let me come out there and do some research. And there, sitting on the desk in front of me, was Art's piece, Capitalism, his most famous piece. And long story short, it's now in our collection in what we call the Art Young Gallery out at the Bethel Historical Society, a mile down the road from where Art used to have his gallery. It's an amazing story.
Hey, Marc, there's a famous pivot that was made in journalism in the Spanish-American War, where if you furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war, and it was the beginning of yellow journalism. At some point, yellow journalism went from the fantastic story into the comic strips and into comics. So, can you tell us how this might have affected art and where this plays into the landscape, as it were.
Well, of course, you had Thomas Nast, who really was the first American cartoonist to have that style. And then yellow journalism really came out with William Randolph Hearst. And he had an editor, Arthur Brisbane, who would write these editorials in these big 8-column tabloid newspapers. And although the yellow journalists were you would kind of think were the opposite of Art's politics, Brisbane loved Art Young. And he would take Art's cartoons and he'd write these 8-column editorials about them. Sometimes they'd agree, sometimes they'd disagree. And they had this conversation that what we would think of across party lines that never happens anymore. Sometimes Brisbane would ask Art to do a cartoon on a topic, and Art would. Other times Brisbane would ask him, and Art would say, no, I'm not going to do that. Brisbane actually tried to get Art Young on one of Hearst's newspapers, and Art said, no, I'm going to stay independent because then I can illustrate what I want. Of course, Art was destitute most of his life because of it, but he didn't want to be tied to having to tote anybody else's line. And he tells a story that in the early 1900s, he illustrated a cartoon for Life magazine that after he handed it in, he felt very queasy about because it was a little bit bigoted. And he went back to the editor and handed him back the $100 check, $100 in 1904, and said, I can't let you publish that. And John Mitchell agreed, handed him back the illustration, and he talks about ripping it up as he was walking down the street. And it really set him to stand apart from the yellow journalism, and he was good friends with all the muckrakers like Lincoln Steffens. He actually had Lincoln Steffens write an introduction for a book that Art never did. We actually found that introduction, and one day we'll publish it and publish that book that Art never got a chance to. So that's kind of where he sits historically in that regard.
But, you know, in addition to all of his political cartoons, he was also an amazing illustrator and cartoonist. Can you talk about some of the other drawings he did, like Types of the Old Hometown? And
yeah, definitely. So Types of the Old Hometown. Our family, we're bookmakers. Hi, Ava and Lucia and Ivy and Leaf and the rest of the crew out there. They're listening. So they're smiling, I hope. We're bookmakers. And while we were doing this project, we, again, through Terry Halliday in New Haven, got in touch with a collector, a gentleman named Glenn Bray, who has Art Young's last unpublished manuscript, something called Types of the Old Hometown. A number of them had been published in the Saturday Evening Post in the 1920s, and they're types, they're characters, they're folks you would see in any town America, small town America, with a blurb about them, little description. And some of them were social, some of them were slightly political. Art was never far from that regardless, but it's these amazing, the village bell, our mayor, all of these, you know, the railroad station agent, things you'd see in any town America. And he tried to get it published from the mid-30s till he passed away, and for whatever reason, no one published it. So the gentleman says, I have Art's last manuscript. Well, we're bookmakers, and it's like peanut butter and chocolate coming together. You know, we said, would you like to publish it? And so we brought out Types of the Old Hometown in a first edition of 333 handmade books. They're hand-stitched, hand-cut, the whole thing. That's what we do. We're literally bookmakers. We make books. You know, we're about 200 years too late to make a living at it. But, you know, when someone comes along and says, here's this manuscript that's 75 years old by this person you idolize, and it's never been published, and you can publish it, it makes it all worthwhile. And it's just been astounding to be the folks who brought art back into print after 75 years.
Wow.
And I get all twitchy when I talk about it.
No, that's massively incredible, man.
And the whole project has been like that. When last March and April, we did the first exhibition of Art's work since 1939. 42 illustrations, 120 pieces of ephemera, books, letters, magazines. The family. He has no direct descendants. Neither of his boys had children, but through marriage there was a relation and a line, and they found out about it, and they loaned us 13 pieces. Hi out there, Amy, Rick here, and family. I think you're listening as well. They loaned us a number of works, and we did the show, and we were able to just show Art's entire life in a room for 5 weeks, and it was stunning. And all of these things coming together, it wants to happen. Art wants to come back. I mean, you could take 90% of what he illustrated back in 1910 and publish it now, and you'd think it was drawn yesterday because we're talking about all of the same things. And that's really why we're on such a dash doing this. Is as a family, we really do feel like we're continuing Art's work. From 1919 to 1922, he had a magazine called Good Morning, and the tagline was, "To laugh that we may not weep." They had just come out of the Great War. Nobody knew what to do. And he thought some satire, certainly politics, but also some humor was what the country needed. He had a cachet. He had been doing this for 20 years. His friends convinced him, start your own magazine. Well, it ran for about 3 years, and he ran out of money because, well, you know, finding money. But he would hire the soldiers who had been out of work since the war, and they would sell Good Morning in Union Square in New York. And he would split the 10-cent cover price 50-50 with them, which is probably why he ran out of money. But he always wanted to support everyone. So the magazine goes under in 1922, and we get involved in this. And my wife, Ava, who is an amazing illustrator, starts illustrating an art style, dip pen, inkwell, and everything. And in November, we resurrected Art Young's Good Morning. And so we're talking modern satire, but using the style and tone that he did nearly 100 years ago to bring his magazine back. And it's been a fascinating experience so far because, like people do on Facebook, Throwback Thursday, well, we do Same as It Ever Was Saturday. We take one of Art's cartoons from 100 years ago, post it with a little bit of commentary on the context, and you wouldn't know that it was published 100 years ago. You'd think we illustrated it, and here it is. And that's what's stunning, and people react. But we can also extrapolate out to other issues that weren't issues at his time and do them in his tone and style. And sometimes you'd never know if it was something he did or something we're doing. And that's really the goal. When we post something somewhere and someone says, thanks for the cartoon, Art, because they see Art Young's Good Morning, that's the great way of doing it because it's just ubiquitous. You know, it's the idea that, you know, Batman, it's just the mask. Anyone can wear it. Anyone can be Art Young. Anyone can make that statement and get it out into the world.
Now, Marc, he did, I think you told me, over 30,000 drawings in his lifetime or more.
Probably not that many, probably about half that, but 15,000, I would say at least. And this is why he was forgotten. When an artist dies, the way they stay known is their artwork gets passed around the secondary market, bought, sold, auctioned, whatever. Art was ahead of his time, and instead of his cartoons being thrown away after they were published, which was the common thread back then, he had deals with all of his publishers that they would send them back to him. And his goal was that his art gallery that he built in Bethel would live on after him and show his work on and on and on. So his 10 to 15,000 pieces of artwork, thousands of letters he had in his gallery. 18 months before he passes away, he runs out of money. Now, from 1934 to 1942, he was funded by friends who had done a benefit in 1934, raised money. Now, raised money from both sides of the political aisle, all sides of the social spectrum. They raised enough money to give Art a $100 check every month because they all wanted him to keep illustrating. That's how much they loved him. You read it all the time. Everybody loved Art Young, regardless of their view. And he runs out of money, and they convince him to sell the house. And, of course, he sells the house to the one buyer who offers a little bit more and won't let him keep the gallery. So his 15,000 pieces of artwork, his 10,000 pieces of ephemera go to New York with him, and he dies. And it turns out that all of that artwork wound up in a warehouse in New York for 20 years before the estate probated. They tried to sell it to a university, but mid-40s, no one's really interested in radical artwork. Everyone's fighting fascism. And then the 50s and early 60s, no one's interested. The surviving son runs out of money, and he has to sell it, and they can't find a university, and it winds up getting sold to a bookstore for the measly sum of $11,000. The bookstore tries to flip it, can't, starts to piecemeal off a once-in-a-lifetime collection, and thinks that they sold all of it sometime in the late 70s. Well, it turns out that they had only sold about a quarter of it, and 3/4 of it got pushed into a hole in the wall in their warehouse in New York for nearly half a century.
Wow.
lost behind other book buys until it finally got pulled out of there. And so that's why now, slowly but surely, there's a small group of folks who are trying to bring Art Young back. But he got forgotten because his work, his books are out of print, his artwork disappeared for, 60 some odd years, gone.
How did they find that extra part of the collection?
The gentleman who had the manuscript for Types of the Old Hometown kept pushing them, saying, "Are you sure you don't have any more?" And one of the workers finally was interested enough, and I don't know how they realized there was a hole in the wall of the warehouse, and apparently pushed a bunch of things aside, and there's Art's artwork in the same crates that it was purchased in, and a bunch of it strewn across the floor and just dumped over on its side. And
well, timing is everything, isn't it? It's a good time to resurrect all of this.
And that's the thing. In some way, you think about it, had he always been known, there wouldn't be that amazing wow factor of here we are 100 years later, and you look at it and go, this is just as timely. So maybe in some way, Haywood Broun, who was a famous columnist at the time, wrote an intro for Art's book, The Best of Art Young, that came out in 1937. And he said, unfortunately for America and for Art Young, it'll be 100 years before Art Young is realized to be as amazing as he was. So we're about a quarter century early, but I don't think Haywood or Art would probably mind that we're a little bit early on that 100-year prediction.
So what's the next step? What are you seeking to do with his work to get it out there?
Well, it's twofold. The exhibition that we did in March and April, we would love to take to another museum. I mean, it's 150 some odd pieces of Art Young memorabilia, original artwork, and ephemera that we can pack up. It's framed, it's ready to go, be it in Connecticut or New York or who knows where. I go around giving talks about Art Young, which has been fun. Did one at the New School in September, and local historical societies as well. And then the additional part is continuing to do Good Morning. And it seems odd to pick up a magazine that's been in hiatus for 94 years and to sort of step into someone else's shoes, but it gives a certain tone that is much needed, we feel, right now. Something that isn't combative, but is topical, is truthful, is just trying to say, hey, step back a minute, let's look at these connections. Because in this internet age, you can't hide anything. So anytime somebody pronounces something, the universe jumps on the internet and looks to see, is it true or not? And that's what Art was doing in his newspaper. I mean, he'd be amazed. He'd be stunned at what the internet can do. And that's why we do a daily Good Morning post. The magazine, we come out every 2 months. Maybe one day we'll get to be more often than that. But with the internet, you can do a daily blog post. We call it the Daily Good Morning, and talk about an issue. And we do it through mostly Art's characters as well. He had a character called the Poor Fish, who was sort of the aw shucks, not really sure what's going on in the world. But kind of like Lear's fool, he would say something serious in the joke or the half knowledge, and you step back and go, okay. And so there is a perfect timing for bringing those characters back. And again, it comes down to, did we write it? Did he write it? It's really not important as long as you can keep. And that's a way of bringing folks into Art Young, is to do something both now as well as show them the then. History can always be a tough sell, but when you show that it's just as relevant, folks really latch onto it.
And are you going to give some of our listeners a real treat today?
Yeah, one of the things that we'd like to do is we'd like to do some giveaways. So we're going to give away 3 subscriptions to Good Morning. We'll do 3 4-issue subscriptions. We come out every 2 months. Next one's coming out March 1st, so you'll get the first part of that very soon. And then in addition to the subscriptions to Good Morning, we're going to give away a copy of that handmade book of Types of the Old Hometown. What's nice about that is all the Types of the Old Hometown, they're wrapped. I was a baseball card collector as a kid and, used to try to get the pack that had the autograph in it. Well, 3 of the 333 have an Art Young autograph in there that was cut off of a document. They're all sealed so that we don't even know which one it is. So I have no idea where they are. I don't know if they're still in there, if they're not in there. It's all curiosity to me. So they're wrapped up, and we'll send you one of those. So I guess the way we'll do it is, we're going to pick 4 emails, and we need to come up with something a little bit fascinating. So let's do this. Find us a political cartoon no newer than 1990. And the internet's at our fingertips, so this is easy to do. Find a political cartoon earlier than 1990 and tell us why you think it speaks to the world and tell us why it speaks to you. So you get a little bit of a homework assignment because we're bookmakers and storytellers. So we can't ask you to do something without telling a story. No, but that's okay. You will take a little time. We'll give you some time to do it, and we'll read through all of them. And we have a literary journal called Garbanzo that is another handmade book that we've, for the time being, incorporated into Good Morning. And part of our literary journal is we respond to everybody who emails, because you shouldn't put your heart and soul into a piece of writing and have it go into the abyss and not get some feedback back, whether we publish it or not. So in the same regard, send in the emails, we'll take a look, and it'll start dialogue, which is what we like to do.
So send that into info@icrvradio.com. That's info@icrvradio.com, and then we'll figure out who gets the prize.
Yeah, sounds good. And if you want to get a feel for kind of how we work and what our tone is, if you're a Facebook user, Art Young's Good Morning is our Facebook page, which is our most active place on social media. Like I said, there's a daily post. The poor fish decided to say something relevant to us being here today, and there's a little shout out to the radio station in today's daily post as well. So if you want to see our wink at the radio station, you can go and take a look. And if you like it, like us. You'll see a daily thing come up. We're not spam folks. We're not hard sell. When that issue comes out March 1st, 16 pages, just like Arts Magazine was, we post it for free online. So, if you want to see what we're about, like our Facebook page, in a couple of weeks, you'll be able to download that as a PDF and see the whole thing.
So you're doing all this through your own book publishing company, Seraphemera Books.
Correct.
And it's kind of interesting that Art's work is from another time period, and so are these books. So it was sort of a good marriage for you. But can you talk a little bit about what a handmade book entails? Because I don't think anybody knows anymore.
All right. So we make books. We're bookmakers, not bookies, not bookmakers who take bets on things, which is kind of fun to think about. A handmade book starts with cutting a couple of pieces of book board, which is a heavy gauge cardboard. We have a big old cutter, it's called a board shear, and you cut it into whatever shape, and then those covers get wrapped with paper, and that can be a photo, that can be textured paper, and what have you. And once you have your covers, you need the inside of your book. So if we do a lot of journals, a lot of blank books with nice linen papers, so you get all those folded in half, and you poke your holes in them with an awl, and then they have to be hand stitched. So you're stitching and you're creating signatures into a text block, just, with all the pages of a book. Now, a book you might buy at a bookstore is generally glue bound with some other backing in there. You don't see the binding. It's covered by a spine. Well, one of the things we do is we want you to see what it looks like underneath. So with types, for example, it has a dust jacket that wraps around it. Some of it's screen printed, some of it's computer printed. But when you take the dust jacket off, you can actually see the spine of the book. You can actually see the beautiful stitching. Once you stitch all the pages together, then you have to take all of those text pages and glue them to the covers. Once you glue them, you have to press the book. So you have these old antique book presses that essentially look like a captain's wheel that takes a large plate and pushes them down. Once they're flat, then you can put end papers on. So where you attach the pages of the book, you then cover to secure them and make it a little sturdier. It sounds confusing. If you go to our website, seraphemera.org, SERAPHEMERA.org, if you look in the journal section or you look in the Art Young section, you'll see photographs of us making journals or making Art Young's types. And you can see sort of the piece by piece. It sounds difficult. It's actually really simple. We do classes where in about a 3-hour time period, we walk folks through making their own journal. And by the time you walk out of there, you've done one by hand. We give you instructions, and short of a couple of tools, you have everything you need to make a book, because it's so much fun to be able to write. If you're a journaler, a poet, a writer, or just grocery lists, I mean, to write in something you yourself put together, it's absolutely stunning. And it gives you that feel that a lot of us don't get after, kindergarten and first grade, because you don't get as much artwork. I was always in classes. I always wanted to take shop classes, and I always got steered toward other classes. And so for me, getting to work on books just became this, I have to do this. I do computer work during the day, so bookmaking is this, way for me to stay connected to actually making in
How
the
many
world.
bookmakers are there?
From scratch like us, I honestly couldn't tell you. There are lots of folks who do book repair, antiquarian. We don't work in leather. We work entirely in paper. So there are plenty of folks out there who could take an old book and rebind it completely. As for folks who are building, who have a literary journal and do a 300 book run of a literary journal all by hand, I can't believe there are many. Usually when folks do handmade books, they do them in very short runs, 10, 15, 20, and probably also get fancier because of that. But we're an outlier for sure.
Caryn, what part of this story got you the most? Because it fires on a few pistons for you. I mean, the intrigue of someone once lost coming back, the fact that he's a cartoonist but he's an artist, the fact that he's able to make social statements that are as applicable today as back then, and the fact that you have a family that is preserving a lost art form. It kind of hits a lot of buttons for you, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, everything that you touched on, especially the message nowadays, I think it's really important to keep getting things out there. And I also love the history of it and the fact that you can actually hold a book in your hand. I think so much is getting lost with the internet, and we still need to be connected to old ways to understand where we've been and where we come from. I love the story that his stuff was lost in a warehouse and then found, and that somebody cared enough to look for it and actually resurrect it like you are. You're actually the perfect person for it because of your tie to history, not only through the Historical Society and your interest, but also through the books that you make. But I really think it's important to get these social statements out. I think we've become quite fearful in our society. And when I looked at his work, I saw that what you saw, same thing's true today. And I think, what we go through as a society, where's the learning process, where we can finally put some of this stuff to rest. And political cartoons are more of a less in-your-face way to do that, where people can read and see, hopefully.
Yeah, I mean, he was essentially doing what has turned into memes on the internet, but doing them in a way where there was a much more specific message of this is something that's happening. And of course, you run into the cartoon with him where if you don't have the context of, who was in office in 1919, you kind of go, who is this? But you take him and you extrapolate out. Like, he did a cartoon in the 30s called Reducing Unemployment, and it's a cartoon of a giant cannon shooting into a crowd of people, and there are limbs flying everywhere. And if you don't know that in 1932 the U.S. military fired on the veterans who had marched on Washington demanding their pay from World War I. Sure, the canon reducing unemployment says one thing, but when you learn that MacArthur led troops to fire on American veterans who had built a Hoover town across the river, 10,000 of them, and they burned it down.
Wow.
Well, then you're on a whole other level, because I didn't learn that in social studies in high school, and I'm disappointed that I didn't learn that. And so I see the history and, the age old, if you don't learn from history, so on and so forth. But in some way, you see somebody document that horror and you can come back to it all these years later. I can't look at that and not say, I want to make sure that never happens again. And if Art Young from a mile down the road in Bethel can be that influence, and if we can pass that around to other people, then it's entirely worth it. Just let him speak. And it's, the fact that we can do this a mile down the road from where his gallery was. We'll never get to have his gallery in the building that he built, but we're pretty close. And we know that he had been in the building that we're in right now. We know he had to come there because it was town hall, and we have a record of him being there when he purchased his farmhouse. And when you can put your feet in the exact places where Art Young stepped when he writes that he would walk through the town cemetery. And then you find a letter that talks about him dining at Putnam House. And so you know he came through the cemetery, and you go to the cemetery, and there's an old stone staircase that comes down through the cemetery right to where that restaurant still stands. You know he put his feet there, and you can see exactly what he saw. And I'm going to go totally away from the political cartoons, because he did a book called Trees at Night, which were these fantastic drawings of anthropomorphic trees. One's called Archangel, and it's a tree, but you see it, and it's an angel. And he did this whole book in 1927. Nobody was doing things like this. And you think about him walking to town every day for his meals. Didn't cook, totally not domestic, complete ridiculous artist to the extreme. And you think of him walking down Chestnut Ridge Road in Bethel and seeing a tree, and you think, is that what inspired him? But what's great is when Art passed away in 1943, they held a huge gathering in New York City, and it was attended and sponsored by everybody in the artistic community. I mean, all the artists at the time, Langston Hughes, Hemingway, and one of the sponsors was Walt Disney. One of the drawings in Trees at Night is called Cathedral, and it's exactly what you think. It's an archway of trees. There is an image in Fantasia that is exactly Art Young's Cathedral from Trees at Night. And I've heard rumors that out in the Disney archives, although it's like locked down worse than Fort Knox, that there are letters from Walt and Art, and I'm trying to get in there to be able to see. But even just hearing the rumors from family members, you see the connection in Fantasia, and you realize Art Young was an influence on everyone, even folks like Disney back in the day. And it's just stunning to think of what his reach was.
He reminds me, not so much in style, but a little bit of Norman Rockwell, because his types of the old hometown illustrations remind me, I love Norman Rockwell, of those illustrations. They're very realistic, and that's what I love about Rockwell and those particular Art Young pieces. But it also brings up the argument, you know, that Rockwell suffered with his whole life. Can an illustrator be considered an artist? And it could be similar in this case.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, that's one of the reasons why cartoons, after they were published in the magazines of the day, were thrown away. Nobody thought of cartoons as art. Nobody thought a comic would ever be valuable. And it's only been the last 20, 30 years where illustration art has really become looked upon as this amazing, amazing act. And, you know, with Rockwell, the Saturday Evening Post, I mean, and that's why, you know, art was published inside, but he was always, and that's another reason why no one really remembered him after he passed away. The political folks didn't want to claim him because he had all of this Americana that he did. The Americana folks didn't claim him because he had all of these politics that he did. So for the Historical Society in Bethel, for us to be able to say he lived a mile down the road, we can do an exhibition of his work that covers his life. Here's what he was. We're not commenting on it. We don't need to. Here's an overview of this amazing individual, and just see it and take it in. And so for us in Bethel to become what will hopefully be the home of Art Young it's perfect. It just allows him to be who he was, warts and all, good and bad. And that's really the important way of doing it. Don't hide any of it.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Mark. And make sure everybody out there goes online and answers the email to get these amazing books.
Yeah, send us what it's going to be in a cartoon from. Yeah.
Send a cartoon from before 1990. Tell us why it moves you.
Yeah. Hey, Caryn, as always, it's just great stuff. And Mark, maybe you'll come back.
That would be grand. Love it.
This is fantastic stuff. Thank you very much.